Event in our series entitled New Technology and Old Rules, Constructing a Crypto Regulatory Framework. My name is Jennifer Schulp, and I'm the Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. Regulation of cryptocurrency sits at the intersection of multiple regulatory regimes. Crypto can alternately be seen as a commodity, a security, a currency, or something else entirely. And these qualities have left crypto to be regulated by an overlapping and incomplete regulatory framework, drawing criticism from all corners. So how should crypto be regulated, and by whom? Today's panel kicks off our consideration of these questions by focusing on the regulation of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. We're honored to be joined by a distinguished panel with deep experience with the CFTC. We only have an hour, so I'm happy to pass along our microphone to our moderator today, Sarah Wynn, who covers crypto regulation at CQ Roll Call. Sarah?
Great, and thanks for that too. We are here too with Chris Brummer, a law professor at Georgetown University Law Center, Katherine Cooper, an attorney with Murphy and McGonigle, and Melissa Netram, a partner at FS Vector, who is also the director of LabCFTC, a financial technology hub at the Commodities Futures Trading Commission. Also wanted to note as well, if you have any questions, please submit those on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube using the hashtag CatoEcon, which is a capital C and a capital E for that one. And I don't know too if everyone kind of wanted to do opening statements and just to kind of talk about cryptocurrency regulation or where everyone wanted to start, but wanted to see maybe if Chris, if you wanted to kind of start us off of, your thoughts in general and just an opening statement on cryptocurrency regulation.
I for whatever reason, I couldn't recall actually doing an opening statement, which automatically tells you something about crypto because sometimes you can feel a little bit under fire. But I guess I'll make a reference to the point that regulating crypto shares a lot of sort of common policy questions that one is having with regards to really regulating any new piece of financial technology and innovation. And one of the things that you kind of notice is that when regulators are going about doing their job, they typically have to make a choice that takes place in something called a trilemma, right? Where they can get maybe 2 of 3 different options. One, they try to do things in a way that achieves market integrity. Secondly, they try to do things in ways that at least ideally enables socially viable or good or efficient innovation. And then thirdly, they try to do so with clear rules. The question that people are facing is whether or not it's possible to do all three at any given time. You can go and try to innovate and do so with clear rules, but sometimes that's at the price of market integrity. Maybe you can establish or achieve market integrity as well as financial innovation, but then your rules aren't really very clear. They're very, very complex. Or maybe you can have market integrity and clear rules, but that generally takes the form of broad prohibitions that can snuff out financial innovation. So I think that crypto is sort of entering this phase, entering into this sort of financial or innovation trilemma. And it's going to be very interesting to see legally how the financial regulators are trying to sort of navigate this set of trade-offs.
And that's really interesting too that you bring that up, because I think lawmakers have been kind of discussing that tie-in between regulating this versus innovation, and been kind of having those ties come in too. So it's really interesting too that you bring that up. So thank you, and wanted to turn now to Melissa to see too if you had an opening statement by chance too.
Sure. Thanks to Cato and Jennifer for having us. And it's nice to go after Chris because he took a lot of my points already. But I think just to add a little bit more to what Chris said, as somebody who was in a regulatory agency, sometimes, it's hard for regulators to have the mindset of innovation, because that's not what regulators do, right? We're often confined to the rules of the road. It's not like you can go try something and break it and try it again, which is often the mindset of tech companies, right? So to try to balance the two, right, where you as a regulator want to promote innovation and responsible innovation, as well as help define rules of the road. It's hard to do that when innovators are very much of the mindset of let's keep trying and innovating and moving forward. It's also hard when there are financial regulations that are completely, written at a time that don't think about innovation or where things are going. I often refer back to, Dodd-Frank, which was the most comprehensive financial reform bill here in the US, which was 11 years ago now. At the time, crypto was just starting and it wasn't even part of the Dodd-Frank bill, right? So regulation and legislation move a lot slower than innovation does, which is often what the issues are. And I think we'll talk a little bit about them today. When it gets to crypto itself, right, I think another challenge here is that there are multiple regulators that touch crypto, and it all comes down to how you envision where the crypto falls, right? Is it a payment? Is it a security? Is it a derivative? And who regulates it? How is it regulated? Should it be regulated? And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but the challenges of trying to fit it into a traditional regulatory box are kind of where we are right now. And I think we're at this tipping point of trying to figure out what comes next. How do we change the regulation to not only account for everything like Chris has mentioned, right? Enabling innovation, but then how do we also ensure that you can continue to protect the markets and continue to protect investors and consumers? Great. So looking forward to that discussion.
It'll be great too to kind of get your insight, too, from like the regulation space and just kind of saying, where do we go here? What is the CFT's role with that too? So it'll be interesting to get your take on that too. And then wanted to turn it over to Katherine too, to see if you had any opening statements as well.
Sure, and thank you to Cato, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. Now, to go to maybe a slightly different perspective, I'm someone who's been in the trenches defending defendants in CFTC and SEC enforcement actions, where they've applied both the Commodity Exchange Act and the Securities Act to my clients and their dealings in cryptocurrencies. So on the CFTC side, I think the question is really from the trenches is to borrow from the Bard, is to use plain meaning or not to use plain meaning. That is the question. And I say that because plain meaning, of course, is all the rave at the Supreme Court these days, that if a statute is clear on its face, you need not go any further into legislative history to try to determine what it means. So the CFTC has been having it kind of both ways. So in terms of the Section 753 of the Dodd-Frank Act added a new section, 6C1. It's entitled Prohibition Against Manipulation. But it actually makes it unlawful for any person to use or employ in connection with any contract of sale of a commodity in interstate commerce, any manipulative or deceptive device. And although Senators Cantwell, who introduced it, and Blanche Lincoln, both in introducing this language, said it was the purpose of it was to go after manipulation and attempted manipulation, the CFTC has applied it to mere fraud in the cash markets, in the sale of a commodity in interstate commerce, pointing out that the language it makes it illegal to use any manipulative or deceptive device. And the Ninth Circuit, in a case of CFTC versus Monex, has gone for that literal interpretation, that or means or, it doesn't mean and no matter what Senators Cantwell and Lincoln said on the floor of the Senate when they introduced this language, or means or, it doesn't mean and. So, if that makes me wonder why Congress would have given a broad anti-fraud authority to a small agency unless there's some limiting factor. And I've suggested the limiting factor is that commodity is a defined term. It's all services, rights, and interests in which contracts for future delivery are presently or in the future dealt in, which means that the cash markets over which the CFTC has this broad jurisdiction are limited to cash markets that are somehow related to the futures markets. And not out of all the hundreds of cryptocurrencies that are trading, only 2, I believe at the moment, have futures contracts trading on them, which I would suggest provides some limiting, and brings some sanity to what an interpretation of what the CFTC's current jurisdiction is.
Great.
My 2 cents.
Yeah, and that too, I think that's really great too that you bring that up. And maybe I kind of want to start off with you then, Katherine, with talking about, and you mentioned this too a bit, but what is the CFTC's then current authority when it comes to regulating cryptocurrency?
So in their view, all cryptocurrencies are commodities. They, in the most recent decision, in a speaking order with Tether, which is a issuer of a very large stable coin, they just assert that Tether, which is a US dollar backed, in theory, stable coin, which is designed to track the price of the dollar, is a commodity. They don't really explain how that is given the definition of a commodity. The plain meaning of which is a service right or interest in which contracts for future delivery are presently or in the future dealt in, because there are no futures contracts trading on Tether. But their position has been since I think a coin flip speaking order in 2015 is because Bitcoin is a commodity, which they didn't really explain in coin flip either. Therefore, all other cryptocurrencies are also commodities. It's their position. They don't really have much of an explanation for it, other than positions that they've taken in federal court.
Got it. And wanted to see too if anyone else kind of had some input too. And I know too, Commissioner Donstomp had kind of offered a little bit of a clarification, was it maybe a month ago or so? And she had kind of said, the CFTC regulates derivatives and not commodities, and just kind of wanted to see too, if what your guys' thoughts were on that, but also too, again, going back to the question too of the CFTC's current authority too when it comes to regulating cryptocurrency.
So we've just gone within a matter of seconds into an extremely complex conversation that with lots of sort of turns, So maybe the best way is a little bit of a running start. So for the securities lawyers who are sort of dialed in and who may not be as familiar with with CFTC law, right? The basis of the universe for derivatives law kind of revolves around the Commodity Exchange Act, right? And the Commodity Exchange Act provides basically the CFTC with the authority to regulate transactions involving something called commodity interests, right? So first, there's the question of then what is a commodity, right? And then there's this sort of logical jump to say, okay, once you define what a commodity is, what then is a commodity interest, right? Now, the definition as to what is a commodity is in section 1. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm lapsing into law professor speak. I hope that my law school students are either like the fact that I'm doing this or are baffled, but that I'm actually doing this again. But so if you go through sort of section 1 of the CEA, right, there's this sort of laundry list of different kinds of things that can constitute a commodity, right? And the running joke is that sort of like everything's a commodity, but like, it's something like onions, which is not exactly a joke. And because this definition of what is a commodity is very expansive, when you then tie this question of what is a commodity interest, which is you take a commodity, but you also then put on top of a futures contract, options on futures contracts, swaps, all this other kind of stuff, you kind of get this idea of what a commodity interest is. So why is this important? Okay. When you look at the nature of the CFTC's authority, it's a little bit weird because it's broken up into different parts and pieces, as even compared to securities law. And so people tend to look at section 1, but they're also looking at something called section 6, and then it's implementing provisions of 180.1, right? And to make a very long story short, very, very short, is the CFTC can regulate, it's clear that the CFTC can regulate derivatives contracts, usually. But what is unclear is to whether or not the CFTC can regulate a commodity as it's being traded in spot markets, or as I tell my students, on the spot, right? Now, in CoinFlip, this case that was just sort of mentioned, the CFTC just basically said, look, when you look at our laundry list of things that are called a commodity, it's very expansive, and Bitcoin is too, and so are all virtual assets, right? So ta-da, surprise, you guys are now commodities, which then raises the question, under what circumstances then can the CFTC exert its regulatory authority, right? And how? Because that how is a huge issue, okay? So the first question of like, when can it exert its authority? There's this ambiguity. And the ambiguity comes up very rightly, as Katherine is saying, in the Dodd-Frank Act, because people have sort of these two different interpretations of the Dodd-Frank Act and what it means for the CFTC. One interpretation says, because it does explicitly talk about contracts for sale, which basically means the expansive view is to say that the CFTC can now intervene and exercise its anti-fraud authority for any kind of commodity basically trading in a spot market, right? Which would, it's like a theory of everything. Like the CFTC can literally exert its regulatory authority in a very expansive way, and that's kind of, if you're going to look at what the words say, that's kind of what the words say, even though the legislative history might say something different. The more circumscribed view, right, says no. I mean, little CFTC, the little engine that could here, it can't possibly be this regulator of any kind of commodity in a spot market. I mean, theoretically, then they could get involved in, if people lie about how many ounces are in a Coca-Cola can, they could, start regulating there. Instead, the idea is the CFTC can only regulate the derivatives, those commodities where there is already an existing derivatives contract that references them, right? So to say, if there's fraud in that underlying market, it means it's making the derivatives contracts all wacky. And in order for the CFTC to exercise its jurisdiction, it should have the ability to exercise its anti-fraud authority in order to maintain the integrity of the derivatives that are being traded and that reference it. Okay, so those are two very different ideas. I will only say that, I guess the counter argument, as I argue against myself, and is to say, well, Dodd-Frank, you have all this, you have the financial crisis, and so there's this idea that the CFTC should be made this more robust agency, and here's where all the ambiguity comes in. So some people will say, no, look at the words. The words are reflecting the fact that the whole idea is that there are gaps in the market, and so the CFTC should be empowered accordingly. Now, the problem, of course, is that not only is there that sort of ambiguity in the sense of how broad is the power. I almost feel like it's a Supreme Court kind of case law. I forgot the one, still working, with the how expansive are the powers of the executive? Well, it's most expansive when, Congress or whatever agrees with it or something. Here's this kind of like how expansive, and this and the CFTC is going to have to grapple with this. How expansive are the powers of the CFTC, whereas this, particularly in crypto markets, where there is this sort of fundamental kind of disagreement or ambiguity, particularly in those spot markets. And the last little legal thing, and then hopefully, because my students don't know where my car is, so I can't bring my keys and start to cut my car, but it's useful for the audience, is even when you then can exercise anti-fraud authority, right? It's not the same thing as saying it's regulated, or is it, right? So, what you will often hear, in my opinion, incorrectly, is that people will say, oh, crypto markets are unregulated. I don't think that that's an accurate statement. They may be underregulated, they may be poorly regulated, there may be ambiguity, but there are rules out there, right? And this is where the CFTC becomes a kind of interesting agency. And one of the sort of foundational questions is, when you look at the anti-fraud authority and the anti-manipulation authority, what leeway, even assuming for the moment that we've cleared up the ambiguities, what does that mean in practice in terms of how the agency would then exercise its authority? Clearly, you can go and engage in enforcement or regulation by enforcement, but then there's this question of is there something like a soft form of regulation that could be implied through enforcement or the threat of enforcement, right? And that's I think where this sort of second layer of questions are popping up.
Great. And that's great to hear your insight too on kind of, how the CFTC would regulate, cryptocurrencies and all these different definitions, to what Katherine was saying, looking at it at the actual words themselves versus different ways. And so that's really great too, to get both of your insight too, and wanted to see, Melissa, too, if you had any thoughts too, coming from the CFTC.
Yeah, I think what we just highlighted is the complexity around the question asked, right? And it's not all cut and dry, and it's not, hey, yes, it's this, no, it's not. This regulator regulates, this one doesn't. This is their power, this isn't. And that's, imagine you're an innovator creating a product that relates to crypto. How are you supposed to navigate that? How are you supposed to figure out what you actually need to abide by and what regulation you should be paying attention to while you're building your product? And this is the challenge right now. And so, I agree with, everything that Chris and Katherine have said, in the sense that, the three of us have been very focused on the Commodity Exchange Act, right? The laws regarding securities, the Dodd-Frank Act, and most of our careers have been focused on that. I keep coming back to, what if you're an innovator who has this great idea relating to crypto? We think it's very complex. Imagine somebody who hasn't been involved in that. And so that's the only thing I wanted to highlight in that sense. I think when it comes down to, Chris made a reference to regulation by enforcement. And I think, we've seen a lot of enforcement over the past, I would say, year, especially from the CFTC in the digital asset space. And I think this is something we got to be very careful about, right? I don't think regulation by enforcement is the right way. And I think that, if anything, it starts limiting innovation down the road, because more people are concerned about getting caught up in the enforcement stages than thinking outside of the boxes. Instead, right, or I should say, on the other hand, right, as somebody who was in the agency at one point, when you don't have the tools in your hand to regulate, there's not much else you can do. That's the only tool in your wheelhouse, right? And so, until there's better clarity, until there's more like, all of the questions that Chris and Katherine posed in terms of where does this fit, and is it under here, is it under there? Until there's that actual clarity and either legislation or regulation, that's coordinated amongst the agencies, enforcement's unfortunately the only tool that we'll start seeing that clarity come through. Again, not saying it's the right thing, but when you don't have anything else, right, there's not much else you can do.
That's a great.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, you go ahead, Chris.
No, I mean, that's a really interesting point, right? And I mean, all three of us, I've heard all kinds of questions, sometimes at the very last minute, from people who are like, hey, I'm about to do this and this, you're sitting randomly in your office and you get a random phone call and I'm like, dude, I can't give you an answer right now because you've just given me 30 seconds worth of a fact pattern in which I don't even know what you're talking about. But and it's an area where things are moving quickly. I would say a couple of things, and we'll get into it. So that trilemma argument that I introduced, for those who are really interested, it was a law review article that I did on the financial innovation trilemma. And one of the tools that we get to is, how do regulators try to navigate this challenge, right, with innovation? And we haven't heard very much talk on like sandboxes and innovation and everything, but there are different kinds of strategies that people are trying to use. I will say that, and I've said, that enforcement tool comes with great, with great power comes great responsibility, and equally important, if you use it the wrong way, it will come back to bite you, right? And it'll be interesting how things shape out, not just in the immediate term, in terms of, what are the enforcement actions that are coming down the pike and what are the wins. But I think that the next generation of litigation is going to be litigation where there isn't a settlement and where people are just going to take agencies to the court, right? Now, in those circumstances, right, you're not going to have clarity for years, right? Because it'll get sort of hopped around over in courts, and it's going to create lots of ambiguity and different sort of senses of risk tolerance, both by other regulators as well as other market participants, right? But, and this is something that I think people should be, or certainly regulators and regulatory agencies have to think about, especially when thinking about their long-term legacy, but because I think that some of the litigation will probably be make or break a company litigation. You can expect it to go as far as it has to go in order for some sense of finality to be reached. And, the higher up you go, the more, challenges a regulatory agency may have in the courts, especially in terms of a risk of an adverse decision. And an adverse decision, even, constitutionally, that could impact their own ultimate long-term powers, right? And I think that there's a lot going on that, in a Twitter-driven, internet age where we're just sort of living in these sort of or lawyers 6-minute billing increments, or normal people's 6-second increments, right? Where we get kind of caught up in the immediacy of these things. But there's a much longer term, sort of 3 to 6 year set of developments that are being set into action that are very, very big and could have bigger implications for agencies than just crypto, right? And query the extent to which that longer term decision making is being compounded into the strategy of some of the enforcement agencies when they're trying to sort of pick their fights.
And two, and I know too, you had mentioned kind of, sandboxes too. And I know that, Ripple, which is a cryptocurrency exchange, they've kind of been involved in a lawsuit, I know separately now at the SEC, and I know we're kind of focused on the CFTC here, but kind of wanted to get your guys' take then too on, that Ripple last week, they proposed this framework, and included in that was, this innovation sandbox. And so, should the CFTC kind of create like the safe harbor regime, which would kind of give these innovators more time to develop their project before being subject to rules? Or what are your guys' thoughts on that too?
So I've always been of the mindset that sandboxes are not a place where, like kids just throw sand at each other, right? Sandboxes are, an environment where you can test and you can try, and yet you still have your teacher there making sure you don't throw sand at each other, right? And so, having that environment, like we just talked about the challenges of an innovator trying to figure out how they fit into a regulatory scheme. I think as as somebody who worked at a tech company trying to do that at one point, right? I think having that environment that's safe to test while you also are working with the regulators to figure out how you fit, I think is valuable. I think the challenge though, and then this is somebody, I'm speaking from the point of view of LabCFTC. LabCFTC was created to be a gateway for innovators at the CFTC, to have the innovators come and talk to them on a regular basis, to not only educate the CFTC on the latest innovations and where they're going, but also to help in terms of, hey, well, where should I be looking when it comes to this type of a product, right? CFTC can't give legal advice. They can't put a stamp of approval on the product, but they could say, hey, this is how the CFTC defines, commodities. These are what the roles of the market participants are. You got to figure out how you fit into that. And I think, and then let me switch to, do I think the CFTC should have something like that? I think it's valuable for innovators. I think there's challenges though. And one of them is that, and I could tell you, because I looked at it, the CFTC itself didn't have the authority to create a sandbox. They had the no action letter process, and that was there, but that was about it, right? And so that is actually one of the challenges, I think, amongst the financial regulators here in the US. Other than in the States, there's not really a regulatory quote unquote sandbox. And I think if we're looking to find a way for innovators to continue to function rapidly, at the same time, regulators to adjust to this new and ever-changing environment, there has to be something like a sandbox or to enable that.
Great. And wanted to ask you too, sorry, you had mentioned a no action letter process. Would you mind kind of going through that too and what that was?
Sure. Yeah. So each agency has a different set of requirements for what it is, right? But basically, as somebody who's stepping into the environment, let's use an example of, you want to be registered with the CFTC, or you think you don't have to be registered with the CFTC. You're doing a new product, and you're able to put in what they call a no action letter request. Basically asking, right, that as I'm stepping into this environment, this is how my product is laid out. This is how I don't think I'm triggering any of the requirements that you have in front of you. And I'm requesting that the CFTC say that, you're right. You're going down that road and the right road, and we're not going to step in. That simplifies it. But really at the end of the day, it's a very complicated process, and it can take a lot of time. Once you put in the request with the CFTC, I mean, it can take a lot of time till it gets to that final step. At the same time, right, it doesn't only mean that you're limited, right? Should you go outside the letter of the law, right, the new action letter that you actually get, it's not uncommon for the CFTC to call you up and say, hey, you're outside of that, you got to come back, or have an enforcement action against them, right? And so it's not an ideal process for innovators, like a sandbox would be, but it is a tool that's out there.
Great. And I just had one more question too for Melissa. With working at LabCFTC and directing that, what do you think they should be working on right now, or what should their role be in regulating cryptocurrency? And should they be taking the leadership role, in your opinion?
Should the CFTC be taking a leadership role?
Or LabCFTC, or should they be taking more of a leadership role?
Yeah, so LabCFTC does not have any policy ability, right? But one of the things when I came on board, then Chairman Heath Tarbert elevated the office to report directly to the chairman, which is very valuable, right? Because the goal was to sit in senior staff meetings and be there at the table, listening to these discussions as regulation was being discussed, and bringing that innovation into the core processes. That's one of the roles of LabCFTC, and I know that continues. The second is, education itself. When I was there, we did a lot of internal education. Now, granted, pandemic created much of the opportunity for that. But I think that LabCFTC and the people who work there still have this great opportunity to continue to be that person, those people inside the agency to sit at the table to explain the underlying technology, so that when an innovator comes forward trying to figure out how they fit into a regulatory box, they can be there with their colleagues across the CFTC team, and try to help them understand how that technology does fit in that box. I know, listen, Acting Chairman Benham, is definitely somebody we heard in his testimony during the confirmation hearing, right? Somebody who sees the role of digital assets under his jurisdiction. I know that, he sees LabCFTC as something that, is helps in terms of educating within the whole CFTC team. And I would hope that continues.
Great. And it's great too that you mentioned too, Benham, because I wanted to ask as well, during that, and I think during the nomination hearing too, that you had mentioned, Melissa, he had said too that he wants to maybe have more authority for the CFTC when regulating cryptocurrencies, and just wanted to see, should Congress, I guess, give the CFTC more authority, and what would that authority sort of look like in your guys' opinion too?
Katherine asks. I'm curious to see.
Well, I think Commissioner Stump has sort of outlined maybe what those additional authorities could be like. So in her concurrence to the Tether decision, she agreed that there appeared to be material misrepresentations made by the issuer, which are a problem, clearly. But one of her criticisms, and I share that criticism, is that the decision does not, it just fined Tether $42 million for making these misrepresentations about where the money was that was backing its stablecoin. I think in a well-regulated financial service, if someone is holding about $1 billion of customers' money, a well-regulated system would involve some authority telling an issuer who's going to hold $1 billion or more of customers' money, maybe how they should hold it. and how there should be checks and balances to make sure it doesn't go missing. Can it just be held by the loan shark down the street? Probably that's not a great idea. Maybe it shouldn't be held in certain offshore locations. Maybe it should be held at an FDIC insured institution. Maybe there should be regular audits. I think that's the kind of regulation that if any agency is going to regulate stablecoins should be looking at. And there are loads of policy issues, right, around fractional banking. If someone's just holding $1 billion and not doing anything with it, is that going to reduce credit? Because banks play an important role in running fractional banking operations. They take your money in and they loan it out. That helps stimulate the economy. It's like in It's a Wonderful Life, right? Where's the money? It's in Aunt Susie's mortgage, right? So I know that's sort of a quick reaction from me. I'm interested in what Melissa and Chris think.
Well, I just want to riff off of that first observation, and I had to testify a couple of times over on Congress about the disclosure issue. I think all too often, even when they're talking about the turf war, and let's assume for the moment that there is one, although that may be a little bit overhyped in some ways. But designating an instrument, designating a digital asset as a security or as a commodity doesn't solve all your problems. I mean, it doesn't even really begin to solve all your problems, in part for the reason that Melissa sort of brought up initially. I mean, our rules for most of our, when you think about the 33 and the 34 Act, I mean, the basic disclosure rules, using the example that Katherine just gave for disclosure, our disclosure rules are based off of assumptions of industrial companies, during in the 1930s, right? So, think of like a Ford Motor Company looking to go, in a certain later stage of its economic development, looking for capital and what kinds of disclosure mechanisms would you expect for a company with a board of directors, making certain kinds of decisions using other people's money, right? That's kind of like the 33 Act, 34 Act, sort of, let's call it conceptual assumptions for registration and then subsequent disclosure rules. Here, if you're talking about a digital asset, much less a decentralized digital asset where governance is in itself something entirely different from governance of a corporation or of a firm, where you're not really asking about your board of directors or who your CEO is. What you're really looking for is saying, well, what kind of consensus mechanism are you using? What does your technology look like? Who are your validators? I mean, but nothing that maps onto, or very few things that are going to map onto, Reg SK and securities law land, right? In terms of what are your kinds of items that need to be disclosed when you're in certain kinds of required documents. And, it really is getting back to this question about the heat of the moment, with all this stuff and, Twitter-based sort of policy, which is highly problematic, is that it creates this sort of false impression that, these are problems that, the problems themselves become memes. Right? It's just like security or regulation or, security or commodity or something, right? As if that really solves the problem. That no matter how you carve up the instrument, and regardless as to whether, under whose jurisdiction you're placing this stuff, there's going to have to be a serious revisiting of the rules just in order to make them logical and effective, given the infrastructure, given the design of the financial asset you're talking about. I mean, literally, even in order to achieve the mandate, and even if we're going to forget innovation, forget the issuers, forget all the techno kids, if it's just a basis of pursuing your own old school mandate, you have to do that, and that's not something that is going to happen quickly if and this is where I think personnel does matter, like the enforcement is one tool, sandboxes are a tool, culture within an agency is a tool, right? Because you have to figure out things and you have to be creative, or you have to be curious enough and hardworking enough to actually, do your job and to figure it out. Despite whatever political pressures may be arising, regardless as to the source of those pressures. And I think that that's going to be hard. Serious policymaking is hard generally, but when you get into things that are inherently complex, it becomes even tougher, right? And I think that for many of the people who are watching, whether or not they be regulators or whether or not they be founders or innovators or policymakers or Hill staffers or whoever you may be, like part of the unfortunate work that's going to lie ahead for many of us is sort of understanding that what does the second best solution look like, right? And that is a very unfortunate thing, but it is something that has to be kept in mind. And there's a kind of parallel tracking, number one, to push for a serious solution that's not being memified by either side. And then also thinking, okay, until then, what's the stop gap measure?
Right. And that's a really good point. It makes you kind of wonder too, with investors, maybe even retail investors looking at this and looking at some of the complications that too come with regulating this space. It's definitely very complex too. And I want to make sure I get to some audience questions. Someone had asked too, is an anonymous user though from Slido. They had asked, is it more efficient for different regulators to regulate the different facets of cryptocurrencies, or should just one take the lead? And kind of wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that too.
Come on, Melissa, you were there.
Singling her out.
I think it all comes down to, I come back to, I think you have to define, one of the challenges here in the US is there are so many regulators, right? And creating another regulator isn't going to solve any problems. I think what we have to be thinking about is how do you define the crypto and where does it fit? And then you have to make sure there is strong coordination amongst the regulators. When I was there, we worked very closely with the SEC. I agree with Chris. I think there's the turf battle is something that plays out a little bit more in the press than it did behind the scenes. Because I worked very closely with my counterparts at the SEC and they worked closely with others across the agency. And so, I do think that coordination has to be key because, if one agency comes out with some advice, it is really hard for other agencies to quickly catch up without that coordination.
I think that there's, when you think about consolidation, so you have a different spectrum of ideas that you hear bandied about, right? Some people are saying you need a new regulator. Some people are saying you need a consolidated regulator, right? Some people say, hey, we're just fine as we are, right? And, and then you see the administration putting out their PWG report, right? Which says, okay, let's go kick some of this stuff to Congress. And then, no one's happy, but what's, with, again, this threat of FSOC sort of hanging in the balance, right? And what I find interesting is that sometimes even people who are criticizing each other, they're actually not just talking past one another, but actually they kind of sort of agree with each other, but they just don't understand that they agree with each other in certain kinds of ways. So for, it's almost humorous at times, right? Because a lot of people are saying, oh, it's like how far-fetched is it, to have a single regulator of crypto? That'll never happen. But then there is this FSOC thing hanging around in the background, right? Which is, though maybe not a consolidated regulatory regime, does sort of point to this direction, right? That if all else fails, we're going to take some kind of executive decision, right? And no one really sort of thinks, again, everyone's sort of looking at their immediate argument in terms of the overall flavor of their position. And you're never going to look for all kinds of political reasons. You're never going to, look, our regulatory system is the product itself of compromise. compromise in Congress and compromises that have been made over several generations. And it's hard to think that there's going to be a radical rethink in the absence of, unfortunately, like sometimes we're more crisis driven when it comes to restructuring agencies. But I do think that one of the questions is going to be, what does coordination look like? Even if you had a unitary regulator, and this is something that I think people maybe don't give as much props even to the PWG report, even though they don't go out and they say it explicitly. Some of these issues, whether or not you're talking about stable coins and a lot of the financial innovation, just more generally, there are a lot of different trade-offs involved, trade-offs that I sort of began the talk with, right? So yeah, you may have certain kinds of questions, say, and relating to market integrity or systemic risk, but there are also other kinds of questions about financial inclusion and opportunity, right, that are also sort of bubbling up, particularly in a world where the legacy financial system hasn't always served everyone really well, right? And so that confluence of sort of multiple policy objectives in a perfect world, of course, would seem to point, well, that's where legislators are supposed to step in, right? Because they can go and balance between their different committees and like all these different kinds of policy goals. And they have much broader consideration of a broader slate of policy goals than a financial regulator with a very narrow sort of mandate, right? So that's the philosophy of these things. Again, we're in a world where that kind of thing is a little bit challenging, to say the very least. And that's why, again, and the regulators are facing their own sort of realities, regulatory realities, legal realities, and political realities. And so again, for all the stakeholders, a critical component of the work is going to be what's going to be the stopgap measure, and then what's going to be that end game.
Great. And that's really good to kind of get that insight too on what they'll be doing next and everything too. And wanted to get, Katherine's, your response to this too of, should there be multiple regulators kind of looking at this? Should there be one regulator? Should there be a whole new one? Or what are your thoughts on this too?
I'd be loath to suggest the US needs another regulator. I think it's a pretty crowded field we've got here. When you go to Europe and you go to the UK, you've got the Bank of England and you've got the FCA, and that's what you got. I do like the question though, because I think the question is, should different regulators regulate different parts of the cryptocurrency marketplace? And I think that does go back to the fundamental principles of both the SEC and the CFTC. Right, because the CFTC oversees commodity derivatives markets that have forever been seen as really arm's length markets. You don't really have a duty to disclose to someone else that you happen to know that the Exxon refinery somewhere in Texas is down and that price of gas is going to go up when you go long unleaded gas futures. In the securities market, it's all about something different. It's about the issuance and sale of securities where there are, by definition, fiduciary duties surrounding the whole everything from the issuance to the sale to what's made public, when you have to make stuff public. And so to the extent that a particular digital asset is more likely to its integrity in the market for it would be more safe and sound because it would fit well within a disclosure regime like what the SEC has. In a perfect world, maybe that's where the regulation should come from. If it's more something like a commodity or commodity derivative, maybe that's something that the CFTC should oversee. And the more it's like a banking product, which maybe a stablecoin is, I don't know, maybe that should be regulated by one of the banking agencies. So I think that concept is a good one. I think what the marketplace really needs, and all these innovators that Melissa is talking about, and they're constantly banging on my door as well, is if we just have a roadmap to where those boundaries are, I think that'd be really helpful.
That's great too. And you're kind of saying too, we don't need like a whole new regulator to come in, but too, just kind of looking at all the ones that we have now and where that would sort of fit then too is really, really great insight. And I'm just looking too at the other questions too that we had come in. There's one question for you, Chris. There's someone, Gary from Slido, was asking, what evidence is there that the regulators themselves are weighing, the trilemma that you talked about, before, the trilemma that you described, what evidence is there that regulators themselves are weighing that?
Well, I'm delighted that the chairman is watching. It's like, well, Gary, I think that that's an extremely important question, right? And I'm saying that because I spent about an hour and a half today in sort of deep thought, thinking about the question of financial inclusion. Right. And I was thinking about it because whether or not you're looking at digital assets, where you're looking at a range of different sort of financial innovation and different kinds of tools, there's this entirely different sort of set of policy considerations that market regulators are not accustomed to dealing with. Banking regulators a little bit more, right? Like when you get into the OCC, you have something called the Community Reinvestment Act. You have a little bit more on the banking side. But financial inclusion is not one of the mandates of the SEC. It's not one of the mandates of the CFTC, right? And when you start talking about inclusion and innovation, because a lot of the innovation that's when you talk about democratizing finance, on one end of the spectrum, it's a little bit of hyperbole, but then there's this really interesting set of questions that are raised because you are expanding participation in certain kinds of markets. I mean, one of the issues with the CFTC is, what do I do with this market that's as much a retail market, particularly when you get into like Bitcoin related things, as it is a sort of institutional market? What am I supposed to do with this as the CFTC, as an entity that's much more accustomed to sort of institutional players, and therefore regulatory design and strategy that's premised upon institutional players. And I do believe that the agencies, who's at the top matters. They set the tone for the agency. Different leaders inspire the staff, whether or not it be in terms of innovation or other things, in terms of empowering or inspire their staff to use their expertise. They've been around agencies a little bit longer than the political appointees. And, that can wane and wax as time goes by, and so it's not.
Oh, I think we might have lost you. I think you might be on mute. Sorry, Chris. Oh, I think we might have lost Chris for a second too, but wanted to see though too, for Melissa and Katherine, kind of going back to that question too. I know Chris mentioned the trifecta. Oh,
right. I apologize. It popped out and I had to get my but I think it wanes and waxes as time goes by, and as a result, you don't always see the kind of engagement as one would expect.
Got it. That's great too. And it's good that you mentioned too financial inclusion with this. I think that's really an interesting point too. And maybe this might be our last question, but I just kind of had a thought too. How should, with kind of knowing, we've talked a lot about the complexities that come with this and how to regulate it, but how should retail investors kind of be looking at this too? Now, we have these Bitcoin futures ETFs that have come out. How should retail investors be kind of looking at some of these complexities, and what should they be kind of keeping in mind too from your guys' perspective?
Well, I think with any investment, no matter if it's a crypto investment or not, right? Retail investors have to be looking at what is the underlying investment, and then the entities that are offering these types of investments have to have to be completely transparent, right, and clear about what the investors are getting when they invest in these products. I would recommend if somebody is interested in buying crypto, whether it's the ETF or crypto directly, that you do your research and figure out what it is that you want to invest in. The other piece I would caution you on is, this isn't a let me jump in and make money quickly type of thing. Like, there's a lot of market volatility in crypto, and it's a longer game than just let me just jump in and flip it tomorrow. And so I would say, like, do your research, recognize why you're getting into what you're getting into in the crypto world, and just like any other investment that you would invest in the markets.
Great. That's good to have too. And wanted to see too, if Katherine, if you had any thoughts too. And Chris, I just asked too, kind of what, how should retail investors be looking at this, just because there's so many complexities, and I could not imagine too kind of being a retail investor in this space and kind of looking at how this is regulated. But want to see Katherine or Chris, if you had any thoughts too.
I would just caution retail to be very, very careful not to invest anything that you couldn't lose the entirety of. Understand maybe what is the use case for a particular cryptocurrency, and will that help it maintain value? Because remember, these cryptocurrencies for the most part are not backed by anything. And so its value, I suppose, would depend on its use case. But unfortunately, I think a lot of the value action is based on momentum and emotion and future expectations that may or may not be well supported.
Great.
Yeah, you should definitely be willing to, as with any investment, by the way, right? You should be willing to and understand that you can lose your money. In that regard, it's no different from investing in stocks, house flipping. I think that investing in general, people should understand that there's risk. Now that's not to say, look, by definition, risk, life involves risk, right? But the question is your risk informed risk taking, right? Or is it not? And can you afford, obviously, to lose? But I think throughout either cryptocurrencies or financial innovation or whatever, there are a lot of things happening that are going to be very transformative. We'll see how they shake out. I've always been, and there's a much longer sort of issue. And again, the reason why I was thinking about financial inclusion has to do with historically the underinvestment in stock markets from people of color, right? And I'm very well aware that sometimes you can have this very weird outcome where well-intentioned policies actually end up exacerbating wealth gaps and inequality. So it's like risk by itself is just that risk. It's a question of how you navigate that risk and the policies that are in place and the practices to make sure that those risks are as informed as possible.
And I think that's a really good point to end on too. And I really appreciate your guys' time with this. And it was so great, really getting your insight on kind of what's going next, what the CFTC can do, and really great getting your thoughts. And I'll turn it now over to Jennifer.
Yeah, a great big thank you to our fantastic panel. I certainly learned a lot from that discussion. Proves to me there's always something new to learn about the Commodities Exchange Act. And I enjoyed myself too. Another big thank you to our audience. We hope that you'll join us next week as we continue this discussion about how to regulate crypto. Next week on December 2nd, Thursday at 1 p.m., we'll be talking about banking regulators in crypto. The details will be available on Cato's website shortly. Thanks again, and have a great holiday this week, all.